Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me for today's explainer. Because, well, we're stepping right into the middle of a fascinating historical crime scene. When you think about how the world's most famous and widely read book was compiled, you probably picture, quiet, ancient monasteries, careful scribes, and just this seamless, pristine passage of wisdom through the ages, right? Well, actually, scratch that. What if I told you the real story involves cutthroat commercial rivalries, insanely tight publishing deadlines, massive marketing spends, and even maybe a little bit of literary forgery? Today, we're diving straight into the evidence of how the New Testament text that literally shaped history was actually compiled. We're going to look at the clues, trace the manuscripts, and uncover the real, very human story behind the pages. So, how exactly was the foundation for the most famous Bible translations created? It's a massive question. For centuries, this textual foundation was considered virtually untouchable. It was viewed as an exact, flawless transmission right from the original authors. But this explainer is going to serve as a bit of a myth versus reality investigation. We are going to peel back the layers and discover the incredibly rushed, highly pressured, and honestly profoundly messy origins of a text that changed the course of modern history. Prepare to have your assumptions challenged as we look at the raw historical data. Okay, let's dive into this. To crack this historical mystery, we first need to figure out who, or rather what, our primary subject is. You will constantly hear scholars, historians, and theologians toss around this phrase, the Textus Receptus. But what is that exactly? Is it a single, ancient scroll someone found hidden in a cave? Is it a pristine copy guarded by early church fathers? We've got to clearly define our terms here and see exactly what this enigmatic title actually refers to. So Textus Receptus is actually Latin for received text. But here's the kicker. It is not one single ancient manuscript. Not at all. Instead, it represents a series of printed Greek New Testaments that were compiled and published way back in the 16th century. From a textual and scholarly standpoint, it basically represents what's known as the Byzantine text type. But, and this is a huge but, it isn't even a perfect representation of that majority Byzantine text. Why? Because, as we are going to see, it was heavily shaped by some highly specific, incredibly hasty editorial decisions made during its initial compilation in the 1500s. It was a product of its immediate time, not just a pure echo of antiquity. Now, before we judge those 16th century editors too harshly, I really want to highlight the sheer massive stakes of our investigation. This single, admittedly flawed textual tradition became the absolute bedrock for the most influential Bible translations in human history. We are talking about Martin Luther's groundbreaking German Bible, William Tyndale's immensely influential English translation, the legendary King James Version of 1611, and, drawing from the same source data, the incredibly important Czech Bible of Kulice. These translations shaped entire languages, cultures, and societies across the globe, and they all trace their lineage back to this one specific series of printed Greek texts. So how did this specific text gain such unquestioned authority over the centuries? Well, we have to look at the bizarre timeline and the intense commercial pressures that birthed it. We are leaving the quiet realm of pure theology and entering the absolute cutthroat world of 16th century publishing. This wasn't just some calm scholarly pursuit. This was a literal race against time, entirely driven by profit, prestige, and the desperate desire to be the absolute first to market. What's genuinely wild about this timeline is the sheer speed of how it all came together. Let's start in 1516. The brilliant scholar Desiderius Erasmus is working in Basel, and he is absolutely desperate. He's rushing to publish the very first printed Greek New Testament because he wants to beat a rival Spanish publication, the Complutensian Polyglot, to the market. And because he's in such a massive rush, he relies on just a tiny handful of late 12th century manuscripts he just happened to have lying around nearby. We then jump ahead to 1550, where a publisher named Stephanus adds the first critical apparatus, showing variant readings. By 1598, Theodore Beza is publishing editions that will directly guide the translators of the King James Bible. And finally, in 1633, the Elsevier brothers enter the chat. Which brings us to one of the most incredible ironies in all of literary history. Listen to what the Elsevier brothers printed in their 1633 edition published in Leiden. Therefore you have the text, now received by all, in which we give nothing changed or corrupted. Boom! That is exactly where the legendary name Textus Receptus, the received text, comes from. It wasn't a decree from a massive church council. It wasn't some divine endorsement. It was quite literally a 1633 publisher's marketing blurb designed to sell more books. They basically just printed, hey, this is the text everyone accepts, and history just believe them. It's got to be one of the most successful advertising slogans ever written. But because this text was rushed to the printers in 1516, long before the discovery of much older, more reliable manuscripts, it left behind some truly fascinating forensic clues. When you rush the printing of a massive ancient text using incredibly limited sources, mistakes are going to happen. And some of those mistakes got locked into the biblical text for centuries. So let's put on our investigator hats and dig into the specific anomalies left behind by these crushing publishing deadlines. This first point illustrates what might literally be history's most famous cut-and-paste job. Remember how Erasmus was rushing in 1516? Well, when he got to the Book of Revelation, he only had one single Greek manuscript to work with. And get this, that manuscript was missing its very last page. He literally didn't have the final 6 verses in Greek. So, to meet his deadline, Erasmus simply took the Latin Vulgate translation of those verses and translated them back into Greek himself. In doing so, in Revelation 22:19, he translated the Latin into the Greek phrase, Book of Life. But the actual ancient Greek manuscripts universally say, Tree of Life. Erasmus essentially created a Greek reading that exists in absolutely 0 ancient surviving Greek manuscripts. Yet, because it was in his printed edition, it made its way into the Textus Receptus and all those later famous translations. And it gets even crazier. This built into an even deeper textual mystery regarding something called the Comma Johanneum, found in 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. Now, this is an explicit Trinitarian formula describing the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. It's a beautiful theological statement, but from a purely forensic and historical perspective, its sudden appearance in the printed Greek text is highly suspicious and surrounded by intense controversy. Here is the bizarre sequence of events. Step 1, Erasmus actually left this explicit formula out of his first 2 printed editions because, well, he couldn't find it in any of the Greek manuscripts he had. Step 2, he gets hit with fierce theological criticism for omitting it. Step 3, he famously promises he will include it, but only if someone can produce just one single Greek manuscript that contains it. And then, miraculously, a manuscript called Codex Montfortianus appears out of nowhere. Modern scholars largely agree this manuscript was highly likely fabricated right then and there specifically to force his hand. Step 4, Erasmus, staying true to his word, includes the verse in his 1522 edition. And just like that, an edition that was likely manufactured on the spot was cemented into the accepted text forever. Beyond just back translations and forced insertions, the Textus Receptus shows some other really fascinating quirks, mostly because it's based on that Byzantine text type. The scribes in this tradition loved to kind of smooth things out. They did something called conflation. That basically means if they saw 2 different variant readings in older texts, they wouldn't choose one. They'd often just combine them both to make a longer 3rd reading so nothing got lost. They also loved harmonization, making parallel stories match exactly. A classic example of this expansion is the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6:13. The Textus Receptus includes that famous sweeping doxology, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever." It is a gorgeous ending, but it is entirely missing from the oldest, most reliable manuscript witnesses. It was an expansion added over time. So this brings our narrative firmly into the modern era. For hundreds of years, the Textus Receptus absolutely reigned supreme. But in the 19th century, the game completely changed. Intrepid scholars started discovering much older, far more reliable papyri and uncial manuscripts, like the incredible Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. These represent the much older Alexandrian text type, and they were literally centuries older than the handful of texts Erasmus used during his 1516 panic. This completely shifted the entire scholarly landscape of textual criticism. And this brilliantly illustrates the final outcome of our whole investigation today. In modern philology and textual criticism, the Textus Receptus is just no longer considered the authoritative critical text. Today, modern scholars rely on highly updated standard critical editions, like the Novum Testamentum Greece or the United Bible Society's text. These modern standards are meticulously reconstructed using those vastly older, much more reliable Alexandrian witnesses. So the massively influential Textus Receptus, the very same text that birthed the King James and the Luther Bible, today scholars approach it primarily as a absolutely fascinating historical artifact of the Reformation era, rather than the definitive original text. Which leaves us with a truly profound thought to wrap up on. If the foundational text for the most influential book in human history was shaped by missing pages, intense publishing deadlines, a frantic race against a competitor, and a catchy 17th century marketing slogan, well, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other foundational historical truths were out there shaped by human haste and really good marketing? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep investigating, and absolutely never stop looking for the story behind the story. Catch you next time.